Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to Moon Outdoors. Recently, my good friend Ryan Cook held a seminar about winter jig fishing. Ryan Cook is a bass fishing guy in Mother Lake region and a tournament angler. He has won many tournaments. He came in top 10 countless times and he's consistently on the money. If you are a bass fisherman, I guarantee you that you're going to find this video very informative, where Ryan Cook shares all the secrets of winter jig fishing. Stay tuned.
You ready? Yeah. All right, so those of you who don't know, I'm Ryan Cook. I guide out of Motherlode. We're talking wintertime jig fishing. First of all, why the jig, right? And why the jig in the wintertime? This is what I wanted to talk about, is why a jig in the wintertime, in the cold months. It's one of the things I'm passionate about. I love to do it. I catch a lot of big fish on jigs throughout the year, but the wintertime it's the best time of year to fish a jig, hands down. It's the best time to get a giant bite on a jig. Cold water months, a jig just gets bigger bites than your average bait. You can go out and drop shot, you can throw a tube, you can throw a shaky head, you can throw all your finesse stuff, your Ned rigs, whatever you want to do, and that's fine. And I do it a lot. We do a lot of finesse fishing with the guiding. There's a lot of guys that want to come out and they just want to catch numbers of fish, right? They want to be put on as many bites in a day as they can get, and that's fine. You can do that. When me and my buddies go out for fun and we're fishing a tournament, we're going to take 8 to 15 bites on a jig over 30 to 45 on a worm any day of the week, and those 5 bass that we weigh in are going to 9 out of 10 times outweigh the 45 you're going to catch on a drop shot. There's exceptions to the rule when you're fishing some spotted bass fisheries or when the bite gets real tough, but 9 times out of 10, if you can put 10 in the boat on a jig, they're going to weigh more than your best 5 on a drop shot, worm, shaky head. It's just the way it is. Jigs basically come with 2 kinds of rubber. They come with round rubber, or what's called living rubber. They also come with silicone. Some of them come 50-50. They make some silicone strands in with them. A round rubber jig, and I'm going to pass some around to you guys. Round rubber jig versus a silicone jig. Actually, I'll pass around 2 of them, because this is really important. This is something that does not get talked about very much. You will see the difference in these 2 jigs. This one, the brighter one, this is silicone. The one in my left hand, this is round rubber. I'm going to pass them around, and I'm going to talk to you about the difference and why it's important. So when the water gets above, say, 56 to 57 degrees, I will use them interchangeably. I don't care if it has round rubber. I don't care if it has silicone, as long as it's the right profile and the right color combo, give or take, that I'm looking for. The importance of the round rubber in cold water is when it's cold, when the water's below 54 degrees, especially right now. We've had a lot of days, we've been getting out there, it's 47 degrees in the morning on New Melones. Now the silicone in cold water does not have the action. It kind of clumps up, it doesn't do much. The round rubber, even sitting still on the bottom, it's still working for you, right? It's doing this thing, it's doing all this. And I can move that bait 3 inches, and I can get it to do that for 5 to 10 seconds. Move it 3 inches, 5 to 10 seconds. So it's that secondary action where you're not moving the bait, but your bait still has action, and that's important. The only benefits of a silicone jig, for me personally, there are guys that think differently, and that's fine, and I'm not necessarily right and they're wrong. This is how I look at it. Prettier color. Other than the color, I don't see any benefit to silicone. If you're a guy that wants a pretty jig, you need all that fancy color, by all means throw silicone, add some silicone to your round rubber, whatever. I don't need fancy colors. I'm going to talk about 4 different head styles on a jig, and there's way more than that. We've probably got, I don't know, at least 8 to 10 now. I'm going to keep it really simple. So the first one and the number 1 jig that I use on our lakes, and we'll talk about the Delta stuff here in a minute, but on the lakes I use a football head jig 95% of the time. 90 to 95% of the time. A football head is what I'm passing around there. The one with the round rubber, that's a football head, right? It's shaped like a football. You guys all probably know what it is. It's not made for real heavy cover. It is made ideally for rock, gravel, your more flatter bottoms. It works around bigger rock, chunk rock. It will work around wood for a little bit. If you get any thicker wood, a lot of bushier type stuff, you do not want a football head. That is not the jig to throw. You're going to snag it up. You're going to get upset. You're going to lose 3, and you're going to say, forget the jig. You're going to put it down for the day, and you're going to go back to your worm, and you're going to catch your 40 fish. that are all going to be 1.5 pounds, 2 pounds, and that's just the way it is. I've seen guys do it. You've got to use the right jig for the job. So a football head, okay, as it pertains to the lake, we're talking gravel banks, we're talking rock, a little bit of wood, no grass. You don't want a football head around grass, it's the worst jig. Second one, talking about the grass, talking about the wood, probably the most versatile jig in your box is going to be an arky head. You guys know what an arky head jig is? Okay, so I'm going to pass one of those around. This is probably the oldest jig head on the market. It's been around forever. If you guys, you've all probably heard of Andy Kachia if you follow the bass fishing stuff. This was his jig, his Cooch's Wada jig. This was an arky head, and it's kind of your do-all jig. It'll get everything done from grass to heavy cover to rock to wood. I said I fish a football head 95% of the time. I probably fish it 85, 90% of the time. I do throw an arky head a lot when I get in the wood, especially like at New Maloney's. So I'm going to pass that around. The difference in the two head styles, one's a little bit flatter, a little bit more pointed, so it comes through your cover better. It has a stiffer weed guard. The arky head has a stiffer weed guard, a bigger hook. It's more suited for heavier line, heavier cover, right? If you're in straight open water, you don't want an arky head. Not that it won't catch them, it will. Like I said, it'll catch them everywhere, but you want that football head because it's going to have that rock and roll on the bottom. As you pull it over rocks, that thing's going to do all this stuff. It just kind of wobbles, comes through the cover really nice when you're talking rock. When you're talking wood, when you're talking grass, that arky head comes through it a lot better. It's more pointed. It doesn't have the action, but it's more made to hop, right? You're going to hop it. You're not so much going to throw that thing out and drag it. So those are the two heads I throw most of the time on our lakes. Now, jumping back over to the Delta, okay, the arky head is on my boat all the time. When I fish the Delta, any river, I'm going to have an arky head tied on, and I'm probably going to have some sort of an actual flipping jig, which we're going to get to in a minute. But if I'm fishing the Delta, right, you're fishing grass, you're fishing a lot of big rock, you're fishing a lot of wood, I'm not even going to bring my football heads with me. They don't go to the Delta. They don't have a place for me at the Delta. The arky head, on the other hand, is going to be in my jig box in my boat 365 days out of the year, anywhere I'm at, because I can do anything with that jig. The other head I want to talk about is just a regular round ball head. Now, I did not grab a ball head jig. I forgot to. I meant to, but I mean, you get the picture, right? It's just a round ball, like a round ball head you would put a worm on or something. It's the same type of head, perfectly round. It's kind of like the arky head as far as when you are fishing heavier cover, it'll come through it. When you're fishing open water, it'll still get the bites. The ball head is something that I have not thrown a lot in the past. It's in my arsenal now. I actually had a client go out with me probably 3 weeks ago. We went out to Lake Don Pedro, and I was throwing a football head, 1/2 ounce, which is my go-to weight, and we're going to get into that. And he was throwing this little ball head jig. And this guy absolutely kicked my butt out of the back of my own boat, which, when there's a good jig bite, I don't mean to sound conceited, but I'm a good jig fisherman. This guy spanked the pants off of me on a round ball head, little 1/4 ounce, little finesse jig. So what did I do? I went and bought 30 of them, right? That's what you got to do. I mean, I'm no fool. I'm not too proud. When somebody shows me something, I'm going to go buy it. And do not ever underestimate the power of a ball head jig. What's his name? Gerald Swindle, right? Mr. Funny Man on the Elite Series. Gerald Swindle, ball head jig, 95% of the time. That's all he throws. He's done several videos on it. So my point with this is each one has a place, a time and a place, right? They're all tools in your tackle box, literally tools in your tackle box. And they all have an application. So you can't go out and just buy a bunch of one jig and get it all done. If you were going to buy one jig, buy the arky head, because you can throw it anywhere you go. So with that being said, the other jig I'm going to talk about, I don't do it a lot because I'm more of a mother load guy. I don't guide on the Delta. I do fish the Delta quite a bit, but guiding on the mother load, a grass jig, a heavy flipping jig, which is that other jig I passed around with the silicone rubber, the bright pink and light tan one. That's a heavy cover flipping jig. So that is a jig that I am going to pretty much use exclusively at the Delta, or the other place would be like if you have some of the lakes that have grass, Tolek. We got a couple Tolek guys back here. You got some grass and Tolek sometimes, certain years, it depends. you might go to a grass jig. Tyler,
Yeah,
Tolik, would you say most of the time an Arky head would get it done though?
most definitely.
90% of the time? Yeah, that's your Tolik guy right there. Anyway, Arky head, like I said, that's your four-wheel drive of jigs. It's going to get it all done. I throw, for the most part, brown and purple, brown and black. I've always made my own jigs. We're throwing Bass Patrol. Now I'm going to be doing the G-Money Jigs thing, and I already told Trey at G-Money Jigs, I said, I don't want your fancy jigs. I said, make me a bunch of simple ones, regular brown, round. If I could pick one jig color year-round, Delta, Muddy Water, Clear Water, Lakes, it doesn't matter. I'm going to throw ½ ounce. It's going to be brown round rubber with no other color in it. I'll mix the color up with my trailer. Don't get focused in on color, guys. It's all about profile and presentation. I cannot stress that enough. Profile and presentation versus color. The wrong bait in the right location is far more effective than the right bait in the wrong location. Let's talk about the setups that I use. When I'm throwing a jig, and I keep everything super simple. If you know me, if you follow me, I am all about keeping things simple. I typically don't ever fish with more than 6 or 7 rods on the deck of my boat. Even in a tournament, I'm not going to bring more than 8. The only time I'd have more is on a guide trip, because you never know who's going to break your stuff out there. My jig rod, like I said, 80% of the time is a Dobbins Fury 735. That means it's a 7.3 5-power rod, right? It's a pretty stiff rod. This rod is going to bend from the tip down about 30% into the rod, and then it's just a pull cube. Now there's a reason for this. When I'm fishing any bait, I make as long of a cast as possible. And this is something that you guys need to listen to. You've got to pay attention to this. This is huge right here. You need to make, on our Clearwater lakes, we're not talking the Delta, you need to make as long of casts as possible. Most of my big fish on a jig, I'm talking big fish, 7+ pounders, come at the very end of a blistering long cast. And you're going to say, well, why is that? Okay, these fish are smart, right? They hear your transducer clicking under the water from your trolling motor. They hear your trolling motor itself. They hear you moving around. They hear the water slapping against the boat, and they become accustomed to this. These fish get heavily pressured, right? Especially like a lake like McClure. It's a smaller lake. Fish is kind of small. A lot of tournaments there. They're smart. I mean, these big fish are smart, weary, whatever you want to call it. They know you're coming. And the only way that I found to catch a true giant on a jig without a little bit of luck or without the right scenario going on, end of a long cast. And you throw it close enough to them, it drops right in front of their face, and they're going to eat it. It's usually on the fall or as soon as it hits the bottom. They follow it down. Another one gets close by, and that's a whole other deal we're going to talk about. But another fish gets close by as they follow that jig down, and they don't want this fish to get it. They don't want Harold, this little 3-pounder over here, to get it. So Big Mama's going to hammer it, man. And that's the only way. Once they get a good look at that jig, you start dragging it, they're not going to eat it. 9 out of 10 times. 99 out of 100 times they're not going to eat it. So why the stiffer rod? You get that cast out there. I mean, I'm talking, I'll make a cast. I'll throw a jig 50 yards on a cast, 150 feet, right? That's a long way. You have fluorocarbon line, and I'm going to get into line stuff here in a minute, but I have fluorocarbon line, which has less stretch than mono, still has a whole lot of stretch in it. People don't realize how much stretch fluorocarbon has. I now have to, I make a cast out there 50 yards, right? That jig falls to 15 foot of water, let's say. Now I have 50 yards of line out, 150 feet, and I have a bow going from the top of the water straight down like this. I feel a thump. Now I got to get that line tight through all that stretch, and I got to penetrate a 10, 12, 13 pounder's mouth, right? I want to jack that fish, and I want to keep them coming. You hear Huddleston guys, right? They talk about you hook a big fish, they just winch them. People don't realize you can do that on a jig rod with a jig. As long as you're not using a fine wire hook, you got 15-pound fluorocarbon, right? 15-pound fluorocarbon is hard to break. People look at 15-pound fluor, they think, you know, it's not that strong. You ever snag up 15-pound fluorocarbon, especially on a tree with a little bit of give to it, you got to almost get on the trolling motor and go against it to break that line, right? It's hard for a fish to do. It's hard for a fish to break it on a straight pull. And you keep that momentum coming at you. You jack that fish and you just grind, right? You just keep reeling until he's going to break your line, and you have to push that thumb bar back, that drag off. You can keep their head coming at you, a 10-pounder on a jig rod, and never let them turn their head. You can do it 9 out of 10 times. You've just got to keep the pressure on. That's where that heavier rod, heavier hook, we're going to get into hook stuff here. Reels on a jig. You can't have too fast of a reel. I throw 7.3 to 1 because I'm cheap and they're $100. If you want to buy a 10 to 1, that new, what is it, the Revo Rocket?
Yeah.
10 to 1, blistering fast. Guys, you cannot have too fast of a reel. You've got to move line with the jig, especially with spotted bass. That's when it becomes a factor. How many times you hook a spotted bass, right? Or you get a bite, you go to set the hook and there's nothing. All of a sudden you reel. He's got it under the boat, right? It happens all the time. It's amazing how fast they come at you. The faster the better. Pay attention to the speed. All about the speed. Make sure it has a good drag. If you use a drag, I don't use a drag. I keep it cranked down on everything. I back reel on a spinning reel. I thumb them on a bait caster. That's just what Let's talk about line really quick. So again, lake fishing, right? 100% fluorocarbon. I throw fluorocarbon. Is it the only way to do it? No. Does braid to a leader work? A lot of guys run braid, tie a fluorocarbon or monofilament leader, tactical bass, and they're big on it, and it works. I don't like it. So what I use personally, I use 15-pound fluorocarbon. I'm a Seaguar guy. P-Line works. They're all good. I'm not sponsored by any of these companies. I'm just telling you what I use. Seaguar and VizX, or if you want to save yourself some money, if you haven't tried it, Seaguar Red Label. It's a great line. And it's cheap. You've got to change it a little bit more often than the InvizX, the BrazeX, that kind of stuff, but it works. I mean, if you're a guy that doesn't fish very often, you fish twice a month, once a month, you don't have to buy the expensive stuff. Don't feel like you have to catch the fish. And if you're a guy that doesn't want to spend money on fluorocarbon, or a lady, whoever you may be, monofilament still works, guys, okay? Everybody's got it in their head like you got to throw fluorocarbon or they're not going to bite your stuff. That's a myth. They've been hitting mono for years and they still hit it. Now there's advantages to fluorocarbon, less stretch, more abrasion resistance under certain conditions, and better feel, right? It's denser, it's more, you feel more. You feel a bite better, you feel the rocks better. If you don't want to spend the money, go back there and buy you a spool of Trilene Big Game, 12-pound test, and I say 12 rather than 15 because it's thick, the stuff's like rope, and spool it up on your reel. And you're still going to catch fish on it, they're still going to eat it, it makes no difference. I have never seen ever, and I've played around with this a lot of times, where monofilament gets you more bites than fluorocarbon as far as visibility. I don't buy it. I don't believe it, especially when you're deeper than 15 foot of water. They do not see that line. There's no light penetration down there. They can't see it. It's all about what line gives your bait, your jig, the best action and the best feel, which that's fluorocarbon. You don't have to have it. Line size. Like I said, I throw 15-pound almost exclusively. I very seldom go below 15 because I'm usually throwing the same jig, half ounce with a bigger hook in it because that's my style. If you're going to go finesse jigs, you want to throw a 1/4 ounce with a smaller head. You want to throw Kitex making a bunch of those cute little finesse jigs all the spotted bass guys like, and those are great. They catch fish. I'm not a fan of it. I'm old school, but you might want to scale down to your 8 and 10-pound test. You might even throw it on a spinner rod. Again, you've got to look at that hook size. It's all about the hook size. Don't pay attention to the weight of the jig. Pay attention to the hook size in your jigs. So if you're going real finesse jig, 1/4 ounce, 1/8 ounce, throw it on 8-pound test. Because otherwise, you throw that thing on 15, it's going to take like 5.5 minutes to get to the bottom of 10 foot of water, dude. It's ridiculous. If I can stress anything tonight enough, start paying attention to your hook size on your jigs, because guys don't do it. I go fish with guys all the time, and they got a big 7.5 foot rod, 15-pound fluorocarbon, and some homemade jig their buddy gave them that has like a little 3/0 dart head hook in it. And they set the hook on a fish, they get 2 head shakes in, and it comes off. And he's like, I don't understand what happened. And like 20 minutes later, I'll look at his jig, and that hook's opened wide up, and most guys don't even pay attention to it, just open straight up. Hook diameter, hook size is everything as far as matching your line and your rod to it. So now we're going to talk the rod and the line to match the hook size. Everybody's so concerned about the weight of the jig, right? Well, 3/4 ounce jig, I need a heavier rod. They don't pay attention to the hook size in the jig. This is critical. If you're throwing a fine wire hook, like you're throwing, let's say, a Johnny C jig, right? California Reservoir Lures, great jig. I'm not knocking his jigs. I've used them many times. They're tried and proven, true, whatever that word is. They catch them, right? Everybody knows they catch them. He makes a great jig. He puts a fine wire hook in them. I'm not going to throw one of his jigs on a Dobbin 735. I'm going to throw it on a Dobbin 734. Maybe a 7-foot. And I'm not promoting Dobbins. They're not a sponsor of mine. I just like the Dobbin Scurries. They're $100, right? They're pretty tough and they're good rods. So that's what I use. You don't need to throw a Dobbins. If you guys have rod questions after this, you want to buy a jig rod, they got a whole selection of them in here, and almost every one of them is going to work just fine for you, depending on the kind of money you want to spend. When you're throwing a finer wire hook though, Dobbins 734, you're talking, not Dobbins 734, California reservoir lures. When it's not a real big hook in a jig, you don't want that stiff rod, because now you have to play that fish too long, right? I can't pull on that fish as hard with this stiff rod. I'm going to open it right up. And it's very easy to do, a lot easier than you guys realize, to open up the hook on a football head, especially ball head, anything but an arky or a flipping jig. They're going to have a big giant hook in them. There's a time and a place for it. If I'm fishing water deeper than, say, 40 foot, 35, 40 foot, I'm going to go to that smaller, finer wire. It's not a smaller hook, it's a finer wire. It's not as thick, right? So it's easier to penetrate, easier to also open up on a big fish. You got to go lighter rod. Typically, I'm going to go lighter line. I'm going to go 12-pound test on that because I am fishing it deeper, and the lighter line with the deeper jigs helps maintain bottom contact. You don't have as much drag in the water, okay? So deeper water, very simple. Deeper water, finer wire hook, lighter line, okay? And usually heavier jig. I'm usually going to go 3/4 ounce if I'm going deeper than 35, 40 foot of water. When you're talking hook sets on a jig, okay, you've all been taught, right? You throw a jig out, you feel that thump, you set the hook, right? They don't hold on to a jig, they spit it out, they feel that weight. No. Throw that aside. And if you don't believe me, that's fine, but this is what I do and this is what works for me, and I'm telling you, I put in a lot of hours on the water throwing a jig, and this is what works for me. When you get bit on a jig, now every day is different. There are days they eat it and they hold on to it, right? They're going to crack that jig, you're going to crack them, they're going to have it in the back of their throat, in the side of their face, whatever. It's going to be deep down in their mouth. More often than not, that's not the case. About 10 years ago, I started fishing team tournaments with my older cousin, right? And I taught him how to throw a jig. And I'd look back there and I'd see his rod, dunk, 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 and he'd just be doing this stuff, you know, just kind of reel down, and I set the hook, set the hook. Well, after a few trips of him catching 90% of his fish that bit and me catching 60, I said, I'm doing something wrong. So I started watching what he's doing, and he literally lets these fish eat a jig a lot longer than you would a Cinco, right? And it works. And it works day in and day out. If I'm ever not sure when to set the hook on a jig, I'm going to wait longer than sooner every time, and it's going to work 9 out of 10 times. If you watch a bass eat a crawdad, like you guys seen it, right, on YouTube, you've seen it in person, you've probably seen a bass eat a crawdad. They very seldom suck that crawdad in and hold it in, unless there's another fish around. But if they're by themselves, they're going to suck that crawdad in, they're going to spit it out. They're going to suck it in, spit it out. And they're figuring out what's the best way I can eat this joker without getting pinched, right? They do the same thing with a jig. Now, especially spotted bass. They are notorious for this, but the largemouth will do it too. I've been at New Maloney's a ton on a great jig bite the last month. And man, I've really seen the importance of this even with the largemouth. They grab these jigs, right? This jig has a hook right here. They have to eat this whole thing to get the hook. They can grab the head, they can grab the weed guard, they can grab the tails, they can grab the silicone, they can grab the rubber, right? And oftentimes they do. They're trying to figure out what is this thing, because it doesn't really look like a crawdad. They're trying to figure out what is it. How can I eat it without it hurting me? And they're going to inspect it. They don't have hands. They can't pick it up with their hands and decide if they're going to eat it. They have to pick it up with their mouth. When you guys get a bite on a jig, next time you go fishing, just do me a favor. The first 3 bites you get on a jig, reel down, keep pressure on them. This is very important. You want to keep pressure on them. You don't want to drop slack in your line. As long as that thing's in their mouth and they feel this tugging against it. Everybody always thinks, well, you don't want them to feel you, right? No. If they eat a crawdad, you think that thing just lays there in their mouth and lets them eat it? It's pinching, it's clawing, it's trying to get out of there. It's trying to get out of their mouth. You pull on this line, feels just like a crawdad, right? It's trying to get back out of their mouth. It makes sense when you think about it like that. Something most guys don't explain to you, and it's very important. I mean, this is stuff that's taken me a long time to figure out. So don't be in a hurry. Wait until you feel that steady pressure. You guys have all catfished, right? Most of you. Throw out some chicken liver, that catfish doing this stuff. What do? You wait until he's got it. You know, now he's got it. I feel it. You set the hook. Same thing with the jig. Jig customization. Really quick. I brought some scissors. Did you guys pay attention to that jig when it first came around, how the weed guard and the skirt was on it? You probably didn't, but I'm going to show you anyway. Check it out. So this is a jig straight out of the package. This is a G-Money jig. It's a sponsor of mine. He makes a great jig. Do you have to throw his jigs? Absolutely not. Do other ones catch them? Absolutely. I'm not trying to sell it. This is just what I brought. This is what I used. Recently, I just picked it up as a sponsor, so I don't have to make my own jigs anymore, which is pretty cool, because I don't have any time. So if I'm fishing the delta, right, or I'm fishing when these fish are aggressive, I'm going to leave a full skirt on here. I'm not going to trim it down, and I'm going to throw it with whatever trailer matches this. Now before I forget, one thing I'm going to touch on real quick, guys. The size of your trailer needs to match the skirt of your jig. I see guys, they'll put a Yamamoto twin tail on here, and these legs are just barely sticking down below the bottom of that skirt. This skirt impedes the action of the water flow to get those double tails to kick. You have to drop your jig in the water with the trailer on it and make sure it has the right action. If your legs aren't kicking, you better trim that skirt down because you're not going to get nearly as many bites. That's another thing people do not talk about. You have to match your trailer to the length of the skirt. So typically what I'm doing, 9 months out of the year, I'm going to take this jig and I'm going to cut it basically right at, I'm going to get stuff all over your table here, Tim. You're going to cut it right at the bottom of that hook. I'm going to trim that skirt down. If you want to get really fancy, I like to kind of mess it up a little bit like it's been chewed on. I don't know, whatever. It seems to help. I like that skirt shorter, especially in the wintertime. It's going to make that jig fall faster. You're going to maintain bottom contact better. You're going to give your trailer more action. And in the wintertime on our mother lode lakes, bigger jig does not always mean bigger bites by any means, believe me. A lot of these crawdads, they're eating, even the big ones that are spitting up, they're those little crawdads like you buy at the crawdad shop to go spot a bass fish. They're like the 2-inch little soft shell deals. They're not all big giant crawdads. What I'm throwing on my football heads on the lakes, almost exclusively Yamamoto double tail, right? It's what everybody throws. It's an awesome trailer. They're pretty cheap. So if I'm going to put a Yamamoto double tail on this, do you see this? This right here, this skirt is too long for this trailer. This, you get that there, Moo? You got it? Mm-hmm. These legs are not going to kick very well with that skirt being that long. I'm going to trim about a 1/2 inch off of that skirt. It's going to give those legs a lot more action. So you, especially with kicking legs, you want a shorter skirt. Does that make sense? If you're throwing a trailer that has swimming legs, trim that skirt down. You cannot have too much skirt on there. Now the weed guard. This is something that does not get touched on enough, and I want you guys to pay attention to this. This is very, very important. When I trim a weed guard, I trim it both ways. I trim it lengthwise, and I thin it out depending on the weed guard. You want the weed guard to, when you trim it, you want it to just barely touch the eye of this hook. You do not want it down like this. Can you guys see this back there? You do not want that. You want this weed guard, when you trim it, to where it is barely touching the eye of that hook. You got maybe 1/8 of an inch extra, maybe. Sorry, the tip, thank you. The tip of the hook, not the eye of the hook. That'd be the other side. This one's got a little bit stiffer weed guard in it, and this is something you guys got to play around with and just figure out what works for you, and it's hard for me to show you this up here, but I'm going to take this weed guard, and I'm going to take the top strands, I'm going to pull, for a football head, because I don't want a real stiff weed guard. A lot of times, actually, if I'm fishing rock on our lakes, I'm not fishing much wood, that weed guard's off of there, right? I missed two bites on a jig, that weed guard's coming off. I don't need it. There's no point in having it. If you're fun fishing, it's nice to have it because it helps keep the point of your hook sharp, right? Thank you for that, dude. I appreciate that. It helps keep the point of your hook sharp. You're not going to have to sharpen it, change jigs, whatever. If I'm in a tournament, it doesn't matter. I'll go through 30 jigs in a day. I don't care if I feel like I need to do it to catch fish. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to trim this weed guard down both ways. Just for sake of time, I'm going to pass this around, show you guys basically what I did on that. That's how I trim every jig I fish. Very seldom do I open up a jig out of the package and just throw it like that. I'm going to modify it. I'm going to trim that skirt down a little bit. I'm going to trim that weed guard back, and I'm going to thin it out. That's simple. A lot of these bigger fish we're catching in the wintertime, especially lately, I mean, we're throwing a jig out on an isolated rock pile, right, 10 to 15 foot of water, and I'm not even moving that thing off the bottom for 30 seconds. I mean, it hits the bottom, and I'm just waiting. Line tight, I want to feel it, but I'm just waiting. As the water warms up, we're going to start doing a lot more hopping, a lot more stroking of a jig, and we do a lot of dragging, but one thing that I cannot stress enough that guys do not understand is the importance of dead sticking a jig and how effective dead sticking a jig can be. So your traditional jig fishing, you throw the jig out, right? Shake, shake, let it fall. Rip it up, let it fall. Shake, shake, let it fall. We do that a lot. One thing I always tell guys, the faster you can work a jig and still get them to bite it, the bigger bites you're going to get, right? You get a reaction strike. Big Florida strain largemouth bass like we have out here in our motherlode lakes, they are not big on watching a bait for a long time and eating it. You've got to get them to react. These fish are smart. They've been around. Most of them have been caught before. They've seen a lot of baits. You've got to get them to react to it. So when I can hop a jig, I'm going to do it. With that being said, there's the complete opposite end of the spectrum. Put these scissors down before I stab myself. There's the complete opposite end of the spectrum, right? It's cold water. These Florida strain, they don't want to chase nothing. You have to throw a jig right on their head. If they don't eat it on the fall, they're going to sit there and look at it. When it's cold and they're lethargic, that water's below 54, 55 degrees, you got to fish it slow. And it's horrible. Everything in my nature, in case you can't tell by the way I move and talk with my hands, I can't sit still, man. I can't do it. So it takes everything I have to throw a jig out there in the strike zone where I know they're at, and that takes time and practice. I'm on the water like 5 to 7 days a week, so I mean, I know where they live, I know where they're going, I understand it most of the time, not all the time. So I know when to throw a jig and fish it slow and dead stick it, and that's something that takes some time. It takes some time to learn. It takes a lot of time on the water and a lot of practice. But when it's cold, I cannot stress enough fishing a jig slow, right? If I'm in a good area and I fire that jig out there, hits the bottom, right? Line goes slack, and always let your jigs fall straight down. Don't ever hold them and let them pendulum towards you. Feed them slack line, let them fall straight down. You're a lot more likely to be in the strike zone where you want to be, where you actually casted, and you're a lot more likely to get a bite on that fall going straight down versus that thing swinging this way, because now you're slowing the fall down. Slack line all the time. And that jig hits the bottom. I'm going to reel down. I'm going to feel it. I'm going to make sure I feel it. I'm not going to move it. And I'm just going to hold it. I'm going to hold it for about 10 seconds. I'm talking right now, wintertime fishing, right? This is what we're talking about, wintertime stuff. I'm going to wait about 10 seconds, maybe 15. If I'm feeling right, I might wait 30 seconds. I mean, it's ridiculous. And I'm going to hop it a couple times. I'm going to wait. I'm going to hop it a couple times, and then I'm going to start that slow drag, where I'm literally, I got the rod, and if you guys haven't done this, so I'm going to fire that jig out there. I wish I had more room here. I need some room, but I'm going to fire that thing out there, and I'm going to have my rod down towards the water, but I can't do that right now. And I'm going to slow drag it like this. I'm going to move it about 2 or 3 feet, and I'm going to let it sit. I'm going to wait. I'm going to reel up my slack. I'm going to pull it 2 or 3 feet. I'm going to let it sit. Every third or fourth pull, I'm going to pop it a couple times, just barely, just like a crawdad skirt. And I'm going to do that slow drag. And that's what I'm doing right now. There are days when you start feeling them thump a jig real hard, they get aggressive. You can start shaking that jig. You can start what I call stroking the jig, right? Pop it up, let it fall. Pop it up, let it fall. That's getting ready to happen here real soon. But all winter long, for the most part, if they don't bite it on that initial fall, I'm a jig dragger. I mean, very slow, very boring, can't stand it, catches good fish. I don't catch giant fish typically, over 8 pounds dragging it. We catch a ton of 4 to 7 pounders, ton of 4 to 8 pounders dragging a jig. But you still have that initial fall to trigger your bigger bites on the jig. That's one thing that's important to remember. So location. What's even more important than all of this stuff I'm talking about is where you're throwing it, right? You go to, let's say, Lake Don Pedro. You've got your main body of water, right? All your main lake stuff, your island tops, your steep bluff walls, your long rocky points, all great places, but you've got to sort of find the spot within the spot. And without giving too much away, what I'm talking about is, let's say you have a long rocky point, right? The whole thing has fish, has a bunch of fish on it. Well, you go up there, you fire 5 casts, you catch a bunch of 1.5 pound spotted bass, maybe a 2 pound largemouth, maybe 3 pound largemouth if you're lucky. You're going to get to a spot on that point. And if you have good sonar, 360, side imaging, that kind of stuff's great. You don't need it to find it. When you find a big rock on that point, or better yet, a big rock pile, and I'm talking, depending on where you're at, it could be the size of a basketball, it could be the size of a Volkswagen, it could be the size of 2 of your Ranger boats, you never know. When you find that spot within the spot, your bigger rock, that's where you want to key on. That's where you want to pick it apart. That's where you want to spend a lot of time, make multiple casts, throw a jig out, let it sit, right? Your high percentage areas, your spot on the spot. That's what I call it. And in our lakes, now the Delta's a different animal, but in our lakes, they don't start relating to wood real good until the full pre-spawn. So we're talking middle of March, usually they start getting on the wood. Right now, These fish are on rock, and the guys that go around fishing a bunch of wood, you can catch them, but if you pay attention, usually that wood is very close to rock, very close to a rock pile, very close to one isolated rock. They go hand in hand. You focus on the rock in the cold months. Trust me. I'm not saying don't go fish the wood, but if you're going to go find stuff to fish, find your rock. It's that simple. Find the big rock, you find the big bass. That may be in the back of the creek channel, it might be on an island top, it might be on a long point, it might be on the side of the boat ramp. Find the bigger rock and fish it. It's that simple. Guys overthink it. It's super simple. Whatever way the wind's blowing, same as a tidal water system. You're fishing current, right? You're fishing a river. Water's coming this way. You're going to throw up past your target into the current and bring it with the current. They feed into the current. They do the same thing into the wind on the lakes most of the time, not all the time. The wind's blowing this way. I'm going to have my boat over here. The rock pile's there. I'm going to throw past it. I'm going to work it with the wind. The same. I want my bait coming the direction the wind is blowing. That's something most guys don't pay attention to. It'll get you 30% more bites, I promise you. If you don't follow me on Facebook, I've got 2 Facebook accounts. I've got my own page is just Ryan Cook. Then I just started a business page. It's called Ryan Cook Fishing. If you guys go follow both, I would really appreciate that. Instagram, if you're on Instagram, it's Ryan Cook Fishing. My website, ryancookfishing.com. Guys, thank you so much for coming, man. I appreciate it. You guys have been awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.